Graeber's general argument is essentially, so the essay starts from his experience in the alternative globalization movement, where democracy and what democracy is like has been at the center of the debate for quite a while. In a funny way, that was also my starting point in starting to write about deliberative and consensual procedures in Greek democracy and Athenian democracy. I had similar experiences in similar years, let's put it like that. And and his main point and his main questions in the essay are, well, first of all, if democracy is inherently Western, which is not a neutral question because, of course, his argument is that there's been a narrative that has been the dominant one that democracy is inherently Western, that it comes to something of a straight line from Athenian democracy, the first democracy as is usually called, and feeds into the liberal democratic regime we are so familiar with and which are in crisis now, but been in crisis for, well, ever since people can remember. Graeber's argument is, first of all, that he wonders whether it's correct to talk of democracy as a form of government rather than as a form of governance, as a way to making decisions together. And if we look at it that way, we start widening the scope to a variety of other experiments, and we start to disentangle notions of democracy from particularly an obsession with majority rule. And here comes the anarchist angle, of course, in the essay, because his argument is that majority rule as the fundamental criterion both of aggregations of options, opinions, and as a tool, as a legitimacy criterion, is inherently tied with violence and therefore with a certain kind of state structures. Majority rule is the way we make decisions when we are sure that as soon as a majority makes the decision, even 50% plus one, everybody else can be forced to go along by the threat of violence, by the presence of a police force, by a state bureaucracy, by that kind of thing. And of course, then he says, if we take away representation, and I think that's a very strong point of his argument, he also connects majority rule very strongly with representative democracy, then what happens? Can we look at other experiments, at other democratic forms? He's developed this argument in a variety of other essays, in a variety of other works. It was developed in the Democracy Project when he reflected back on Occupy Wall Street. But of course, one of the most, to me, incredible chapters of The Dawn of Everything is precisely trying to find those kind of moments or experiences of democratic decision-making in egalitarian pre-state or kind of state structures. So this was the general thrust of his argument. So why was Athenian democracy so central to it, Greek democracy in general? It was so central because it is so central to the narrative of an uninterrupted line of democracy, or at least kind of a resumption of democracy in the West, which comes from a line, and it is central to a particular view of democracy, that particular view that connects it with majority rule. He thinks, as I do, that that line of argument is pernicious. A point that was made in the notes and during the discussion last time, which I think was a very good point, is also that this narrative seems to be almost designed to make it easier for non-Western or non-fully Western countries to reject democracy wholesale as something that does not belong to them. It's something that is part of a Western tradition, and any kind of ideal reliance on democratic form becomes immediately something that is due to Western imperialism or something. It becomes an excuse in a way to indulge in authoritarian form of any kind by compartmentalizing democracy as something that belongs just to this tradition, which is an idiosyncratic one and is ours. And my own contribution, in a sense, to that was that we could try to displace the narrative of Western liberal democracy coming from Athenian democracy. We can try to tell people that what they did and how they did it in ancient Greece doesn't matter so much. Or perhaps we can try to decolonize Athenian democracy in ancient Greece too. We can try to test, as I've been trying to do, whether this way of looking at Athenian democracy, which is the way Graeber looks at it too, as a rather early form of state-sponsored majoritarianism in line with modern liberal democracy actually corresponds to the evidence we have, or whether that's been imposed on ancient realities by people that were all too keen to find a genealogy for the kind of regimes they were instituting in the 20th century, in the 19th century, essentially. And my answer was that if we look hard enough, in fact, we find that Athenian democracy itself, and Greek democracy more widely, does rather look like the kind of extra-European democracies that Graeber describes, that Athenian democracy did not, by and large, make political decisions by majority rule. That is, structures were oriented towards equal deliberation and towards the achievement of consensus. That the main criterion of legitimacy was that all positions should be voiced and that people should talk it to death until they come to something everybody can be on board with. And the reason for that is precisely the reason that Graeber describes consensus as desirable for. That is that in the Greek city was continuously subject to the possibility of stasis, of civil strife, which was its own kind of version of people questioning the system or walking away in a sense. And because of that, majority voting could not be a reliable tool of political decision making, even in a place like Athens that was fairly big compared to most of the realities Graeber analyzes, because if you keep splitting in the middle, soon enough you're going to start stabbing each other. That was kind of the point. So I don't want to go on too long. I think my concern is essentially, first, like, if we take Greek democracy away from that narrative, which David Graeber very much, with very good reason, did not like, and we insert it instead into decolonized narrative of other forms of democratic governance, does it become helpful in some other way? I think one way it becomes helpful is in terms of scale. Many of these democracies were big places. Athens had like something between 300,000 and 400,000 people and run assemblies of, well, consistently over 6,000 people all the time, and they still manage to decide like that. We don't have many parallels for that. And also, it becomes interesting about how you create the kind of training, the kind of education to consensual deliberation together in a capillary way all across society. And that's where I think looking at the plurality of associations, subdivision, spontaneous political groups that fed into assembly and high-level politics in Athens is where it's useful, because this model of decision-making in a place like Athens, like in most Greek democracy, was reproduced consistently across all levels. Whether you met, whether a professional group of winemakers, a cultic association, or a group of young people in civic and military training, decided to meet and make a decision, whenever that happened, the model was always the same. That was how they were meant to make decisions. So I think I'll stop here, and I just threw a few things out there, and perhaps we can start with conversation. And again, thank you for having me.
Leopoldo wants to talk, but maybe I can first ask if Mirko can elaborate or describe in more details how precisely or how much we know about different assemblies, like details, how they were hosted in ancient Greeks, and the difference between the different policies, if there were any, because that's what we asked last time. We didn't have time to go into details.
Sure. So the best attested is, of course, Athens, mostly from Athens in the 4th century BC. But towards the end of from the middle of the 4th century BC, we have two phenomena that go together. First of all, we have a veritable explosion of epigraphic evidence, of inscriptions, which detail, basically report decision, and they're very anal about how you make the decision, how the procedure, who was involved, who put something to the vote, who participated, who made the proposal, who made an amendment. So they're very informative, and we have these from basically all over the Greek world. John Ma, in a recent book and in previous articles, talked of the period from the middle of the 4th century BC as a period of the Great Convergence, he called it, because that's the period when oligarchy, essentially census-based regimes, I should preface, in a particular sense, all Greek regimes, including democracy, were or could be described to an extent as oligarchic, in the sense that, of course, only adult males were allowed to participate in political decisions, and in the sense that all these places had slaves. So this is kind of a way to preface it. But there is a very significant difference between regimes that are quintessentially exclusionary on socioeconomic lines. That is, there was a leisure class in ancient Greece. People described themselves as wealthy if they didn't have to work for a living. In certain polis, in certain cities, throughout the 5th and 4th century BCE, rich people, elite people, tried to close down participation in political institutions and decision-making and reduce it only to those that didn't have to work for a living, that were very rich. Democracies were those regimes in which, as long as you were born there from parents from that place, so you, like in modern democracies, as long as you were a citizen of the place, and as long as you were free, therefore, you had access regardless of how much money you had, or regardless of whether you had any money. You could be very poor and you had exactly the same right to speak, to make proposals, to do all the magistracies. And of course, many of these regimes, we actually have evidence that everybody spoke and everybody made proposals, whatever their background. That's what elite critics of democracy in the Greek world, including Plato and Aristotle, all the famous guys, really hated about democracy. They hated the fact that elite people like them should get up and say what they thought, or advise the people, or talk in the assembly, and then a shoemaker would get up and speak and talk back and say, I think that's rubbish, I think we should do something else. They were incensed by the possibility that craftsmen, shop owners, rowers, fishermen would stand up to them and just sometime win the day. And of course, also all of these people also sat through in all kind of magistracies that were just elected by lot. Or now, by the mid-4th century, this model, the democratic one, wins in the Greek world. It's fair to say that it just wins. So oligarchy, apart from very marginal area like Crete, by and large disappears. And for a good 2-3 centuries, all cities are governed roughly in the same way. They have no census, they have open assemblies, they have a certain amount of selection by lot. So the kind of structures I was describing are kind of like this. And also, although there are local differences, and some of them are subtle and do affect the extent of the degree of democraticity of these democracies, the Great Convergence also means that these places kind of work all the same way. Some people think that they all model themselves on Athens. Some people think they came to some kind of common institutional model through exchange or whatever. But the interesting thing to me is that what we're talking about is not a handful of cities. We are talking about well over 1,000 city-states or citizen states, whatever you may want to call them, all around the Eastern Mediterranean and well on. So, and we have evidence, a lot of evidence, inscriptional for hundreds of them. And we could reconstruct their procedures. We can see that they had open assemblies. We have voting figures, which means that we know that they voted unanimously. We also know that most of the time they did not vote by secret ballot, very rarely did so. Mostly it was just raising hands, kind of like that. We can talk about the vote and the place of the vote in how they made decisions. So there are differences, local differences, but the model I described, it's fair to say that in scholarship, the consensus is that this was the standard way democracies decided across the Eastern Mediterranean for 200 years, and there were thousands of places that were run like that, of all sizes.
Leopoldo.
Well, actually, this jumps in. Hi, everyone. This jumps in very well with what I wanted to say. That I work on the Levantine city-states in the Iron Age. So mostly Syrian, Southern Anatolian, but also everything. So everything that is Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine right now.
Right.
And you have very different but very similar perspectives in many ways. These are cities that get crushed the moment in which instead by the Assyrian Empire, in the moment in which instead in Athens you start developing more solid structures, so they don't get to the same point that you would see in Greece, in the Aegean. But these are contexts in which we know that very similar things were happening, not only in Greece. So by a decolonizing approach would also want to, yes, these things are happening in the Aegean, but they were kind of happening everywhere, and they were kind of all in contact. And adding on that, it might be that there's really like a much bigger tradition that we're not really able to see in sources. So archaeological record, all the documents that we get to translate and all of that, these give a very limited perspective. And I was actually 2 weeks ago at a presentation of a new book on the history of strikes in the Roman Empire. So it's called Literary Strike. And one of the interesting things is that in the literature, normally it's assumed that the Middle East is the place of absolute Oriental monarchies and this idea of very centralized, this is Marx that talks about it, this very centralized state that runs outside of the economy and outside of everything. When it comes to, we arrive to the Roman Empire, the places that have the longest tradition of strikes among workers are Western Anatolia, so contemporary Western Turkey, Egypt, and Northern Africa. Mm-hmm. These is where you see all the strikes. It's not in the West. Yeah. Where you have, and so thinking of broadening what comes from the evidence that comes from Athens and it comes from Greece, you have very big traditions that are happening just outside. And normally we're not putting a spotlight on them. Yeah. Yeah. So yes, I wanted to feed this also into the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I completely agree. I mean, I think Athens and Greek democracy in general should be analyzed as a historical phenomenon within that tradition and in parallel to those traditions, and not as some kind of precursor of modern liberal democracy, which doesn't mean that it doesn't have anything to say to modern liberal democracy. I don't think that political theory should stop looking at it, but not for confirmation of what they already know. And so about the kind of the Anatolian and the Near Eastern context, you're exactly right. You do have city-state cultures there, and you have evidence of assemblies, which look very much like what you find slightly later in the Greek world, and the baby is kind of strangled in the cradle by some kind of authoritarian empire. I'll give you another example, which I love, well, for all the worst reason, but I love as an example of how things can go wrong, from slightly later. Well, perhaps not even particularly slightly later, but if you look at 7th and 6th century Phrygia, what you do find is developments toward urbanly organized political form, which are very similar to what you find in continental Greece or in the colonies. Sometimes in terms of what we may call state formation, or perhaps just more sensibly, just institutionalization of these forms, what you find is that they're perhaps a couple of steps back, but they're obviously going in exactly the same direction. And then suddenly, all of this disappears. All evidence of this kind of state formation disappears entirely. And people have been trying to rack their brains about why that happened. Peter Thornman wrote, an historian from Oxford, wrote a wonderful article in which he argued for an anarchist drive in Phrygia, in which they just decided that they wanted to stay under the level of under the radar of wider powers because of what had happened. I have a slightly different explanation of what happened, and a colleague of mine, David Lewis, also has been pushing this kind of explanation. I think what happened there instead was that Greece and the Greek cities of the Aegean had some kind of economic explosion. They became very rich kind of all of a sudden, and because they were slave owners and they needed slaves, suddenly in a place like Phrygia, which was slightly behind in development, selling your neighbor became more convenient and an easier way to become richer than invest in communal forms of decision making and institutionalization, which means that the growth of these particular cities are probably directly responsible for an involution of those forms over there. these people became slaves, these areas became slaving zones. But that is another interesting example. And of course, when the polis model then widens in its spread from the later century, a lot of these areas restart kind of a trajectory they already had. They just often start saying the same things they were doing in Greek. So they use institutions that sound to us Greek, but in reality they are a translation. So I'll just stop now, but thank you for that.
So if anybody has a question, I don't see. Stas?
Hey Mirko, this is an understanding question. The situation you just described, could you remind the location and date?
The what? Sorry, I missed what you said for a second. Can you repeat that?
The situation you just described, could you? I missed the start, the location and date.
In my last answer,
yeah,
I was talking about Phrygian cities, 7th and 6th century BC.
And Phrygian is?
Phrygia is is an area in Anatolia, essentially, in southern Anatolia. Peter Tolman has written a nice book recently, which is called The Ancient Life of Villages, or The Life of Ancient Villages, something like that, in which he looks at Roman Phrygia, and it looks like non-proper urbanized areas, but village kind of realities do seem to resume the tradition later by interjecting polis models. But that's very good stuff to read, and he's a wonderful writer, so you should check it out.
Thank you.
So maybe I would be interested to ask more in details. What did they decide about in the assemblies? Because still they were all societies with slavery and a very specific understanding of property that just create this conflict between rich and poor, and not all the societies had the same understanding of family and property, and
Yeah. There's also a question that ties in quite nicely in the chat, which is whether the massive slave population in Athens was a necessary condition for such popular assemblies to be effective. So perhaps I can answer these together because they are connected. So yeah, it's difficult to talk about when people talk about slavery as being a precondition of such wide and successful assemblies. The implication is usually that the only reason for which people could participate in mass in this form of democratic egalitarian decision making was because they had slaves. That's probably not the case, meaning that precisely the kind of constituency that was considered the lower classes and so much hated by the elite were the kind of people that had to work for a living. They sometimes had slaves. Even the very poor in Athens could sometimes afford one slave. Slave prices were very, very low at that time in Athens, but they usually had to work side by side with them, which was part of the reason for which they could be dismissed and calls could be made to disenfranchise them. If you work side by side with a slave, you live in the same way as a slave. Why you're not a slave? That was kind of the argument that the elite made against them. So in that sense, but in general, like these form, all of these kind of cities had slaves, but the degree to which they had slaves was very variable. In Athens, they had a lot of slaves. In other places, they would have had fewer slaves. Also, this kind of model lasts for several centuries. Slave prices go up. Slaves do become more the kind of thing that only elites get towards the end of the period, but the forms of decision making don't really change. And also, one example of what I'm talking about is that in Athens and elsewhere, when you had full democracy and you had participation in assemblies, in magistracies, in councils, selected by lot for everybody, one of the preconditions for that was that participation of that kind should be paid. So elite critics did not like that democracy paid people for participate politically, but democracy across the board did. Which means that the implication was that the day you go to the assembly, which is fairly often, is like 2-3 times a month in most places, could be 1 time, could be 4. The day you go to the assembly, you get paid. you get paid the equivalent of the standard salary a normal average laborer would get for working. So which means that you can go. Likewise, if you want to go to the theater, you get paid. If you become a member of the council, which is enormous, in most cities is compared to the population, councils were enormous. And there were rules on non-iteration that meant that to man those councils, you basically needed to have everybody at least once in their lifetime become a member of the council. Well, if you did that for a full year or for 6 months, you got paid throughout. So that in one sense, they didn't participate just because they had slaves to do their job. They participated because the system was designed in such a way. On another side, I do think that it's very difficult to disaggregate this society. I think talking about these democratic systems and the form of citizenship they advocate for without bringing in that socioeconomic inclusion is predicated on some kind of ethnic or racial exclusion, you just lose a bit. And in a funny way, I think that's why they're so interesting, because these are dynamics that we see also, for example, in modern social democracies. And these are dynamics that we find also in a variety of other pre-modern society explored by Graeber and others that have similar forms of decision-making. This trade-off between hierarchization or horizontality and inclusion and exclusion. I mean, I could give you example beyond Greece, for example, in Polynesian assembly systems, there is something very unsavory about the social cost of institutional egalitarianism, which we cannot cancel out. Did I miss something here? I'm just looking on the side to make sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm hate to ask all the questions. If somebody else want to join me,
Yeah, you go on.
can I?
There
Yeah, I
is-
would just. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, there is a
Ola?
question in the chat. What are from Sarah? What are the lessons for us today? Can or will assemblies allow us a way to face the poly crisis and escape the grip of billionaires?
Yeah. Wow. Yes. Well, that's what I always get nervous. I'm a historian. I'm not a theorist. So, but I can tell you what I think. To give a slightly circuitous answer, I think one of the, well, let's be frank, slightly non-productive ways in which Greek democracies are used in debates about modern democracy is the following. Because there is an assumption of continuity, even when Greek democracy is brought up by political theorists on the left, what they focus on is systems of popular control and accountability of political or socioeconomic elite. They look at Athens as a place in which you still have kind of a socioeconomic and political elite. You cannot not have it. That's always the assumption. But they were better at keeping them in check or at making them work for the collectivity. I don't think that's the core of what was happening there. I think Athens and most Greek democracies are an example of the fact that if you want to keep in check elite captures, the key is not just institution to keep in check the elites. The key is wide participation by all, grassroots direct participation at all levels. I think this stuff worked because everybody was doing it, not just in the assembly. It was just the only way they could make decisions. And there was a culture of non-deference, of lack of deference for any kind of authority or whatever. The only deference they had was perhaps for their fellow citizen when he was doing the interest of the polis. But that would be for a day or 3 weeks or 6 months, and then it would be your turn. This kind of model, I think, I don't believe, I have grown kind of skeptical of proposals of plebeian democracy, as they call it now, or plebeian republicanism, or which are all about creating institutional structure that will make the interest a bit more of the lower classes. I think this is a system. These were systems in which the lower classes kept it all for themselves by and large, and that was how they managed to counter elite captures of institutions and of resources and all of that. So that's my tuppence, but.
Can I ask another question? Thank you. I don't know a lot about ancient history, probably a little, but my question is a follow-up on the assemblies. First of all, how did people decide what questions make it to the assembly? If you could tell a little about it, maybe not only in ancient Greece. And another one, if there are examples of not like decentralized assemblies, but occasions of decision making in smaller assemblies that don't police or like make decisions for the whole state or the whole city, but maybe for smaller parts of the cities or communities or something like that.
Yeah. So to answer your second question, that is the easier one. Yes, all over the place. So bigger cities were usually divided in subdivisions, and these were formal subdivisions. But and those formal subdivisions, each one of them had their own assembly that made its own decisions, and but also there were informal associative forms all over. There were kinship groups, pseudo kinship groups. There were professional associations. There were associations of immigrants that got a voice. There were cults run by immigrants, allowed by the city, and I think the hegemony of the democratic egalitarian polis model was such that at all of those levels, in all these kind of autonomously and grassroots springing kind of environments, they always made decisions in the same way. So they would have exactly the same, more or less exactly the same assembly procedure when there were 20 people around the fire deciding on sacrifices for a gods or deciding on tariffs on a particular product that a particular group of shoemakers are making, as there are in the assembly when they decide about war or about big honors or about big fiscal policy. It was the same everywhere. And it's not the case that everything had to pass in the assembly. In fact, most decisions by individual subdivision, as long as they were legal by a certain body of law, they were sovereign as soon as they were valid as soon as the subdivision had made it, or as soon as the association had made it. There was no need to be confirmed. There were only certain spaces. For example, one example, just to give one example that I always find kind of funny, is that we have in the 4th century BCE from Athens, we know that it became common practice by all sorts of association, and even by foreign cities and by subdivisions and by small groups to honor particular members for having done something cool, something as little as having made a good proposal or whatever, and to make it bigger, to make it cooler, they would decree that this honor should be announced in the theater during the festival of the whole city. And obviously that was allowed. They could just do it. Even a small subdivision or association could make the decision. And they only legislated against it towards the end of the century, when it became kind of clear that basically they could hardly do the performances anymore, because every 3 seconds there was somebody getting up and announcing an honor passed by somebody. And that's when they legislated saying, if you want to announce it there, you've got to ask permission to the assembly. It was a public order kind of issue. In terms of what decisions, what proposals made it to be decided. Okay, so there was, in most Greek cities, there was a basic rule that said that you could only discuss or deliberate in the assembly on something that the council had put in the agenda. That sounds like a strong limitation, but It wasn't really, because of course the assembly could freely tell the council what they put in the agenda, and the council was randomly selected, composed by 500 Athenians, representative of everybody, and was on average, in fact, even more kind of lower class than the assembly itself. So it was more a matter of kind of, again, of public order and being able to run the meeting. But within this remit, once you had a generic topic you could discuss that was part of the agenda, anybody could make a proposal. And actually, we have evidence that people wrote down proposals on the spot. Some people prepared proposals written down before, and then they saw that the debate was going in some other direction and threw them away. Some others saw that it was going in another direction, so they drafted it on the spot, something to... but what they did have was what we would call in the alternative globalization movement, or in Occupy, what Graeber would call facilitators. You had people whose job was to run the debate. These people were selected by lot on the morning of the event, and they were in charge only for one day in Athens. So they were completely random people that had to decide, but their job was essentially to follow the debate, see where the discussion was going, see if there was a consensus forming of a kind or another, and they would more or less decide which proposal would be finally put to the vote. But essentially, they only put to the vote a proposal when everybody had already agreed on it in discussion. That was their job. And a big part of that was multiple speeches. There was no limit to the number of speeches notionally, only the proedroi, these people could decide when to put an end to it. But also, and they were of course liable, if they did it wrongly or if they tried to stir the debate too badly, they could be brought to court for that. But also, so there was no notional limit to the number of speeches, no notional limit to the number of the proposals, but there were particular institutional devices that meant that anything that was divisive or on which people hadn't agreed already had a very low chance to even make it to the vote, because it could be vetoed by anybody. And if you got 6,000 people and anybody can raise their hand and say, I think this is illegal, which was what they had to say, then you need to kind of push for consensus, because otherwise there's going to be at least one guy raising his hand and saying that. And the last thing I should say is that something that always annoys my deliberative Democrat colleagues in political theory departments, not to make it sound too much like rational deliberation in an Habermasian way, I think one of the main ways in which people were heard was through shouting. People made speeches, but also people shouted. Agreement or disagreement, and that was also a way in which the facilitator could get a sense of where he was going, of how he was going, of what kind of line of argument was the right one. It was a very messy affair, but somehow they were so heavily socialized into it that it worked. Of course it worked until it didn't, and then when they didn't, they started stabbing each other, as I said before, but by and large it did work.
So may I ask this question about Michael Hudson, who is often our often speaker and who will be on the 4th of April again. So for Hudson, one of the important things about grassroots democracy in connection with idea of money is that there is no mechanism of debt cancellation.
That's interesting. Okay, that's loom large in the world of the Greek cities, but mostly kind of in earlier or later period. The reason much evidence of a debt crisis in a place like Athens, or anyway in most cities in the 4th century or in the 5th centuries, there's evidence of fairly high level of redistribution, and people had debts, but there is very little evidence that they got to the breaking points because of that. That's when you go towards more elitist regimes, when democracy is still formally still the same, like from the mid-2nd century BC for the next century or so, and in certain places even before that, you do find evidence of elite capture. When you do find evidence of elite capture, you do find constant debt crisis, and most of these debt crises result in stasis. Stasis often starts with heated assembly debates or demagogues, which is a Matt Simonton has argued that, I think correctly, that is an insulting way of talking of politicians that quite prominently and consistently take the side of the poor people, essentially. You start finding them proposing that cancellation all the time, and then when that doesn't happen, you find then violence and things like that. So it is a fact that there is little evidence of complete debt cancellation anywhere in democratic cities during this period, but there is evidence of like debt consolidation, some kind of lenience in debt collection, reduction of debts as a result of political strife. But the trouble is that this usually happens at a time in which the actual agency of the lower classes in this institution seems to have gone down considerably because of the influence of Hellenistic kings and of outside actors and wealth coming from elsewhere. It's a difficult question. I think certainly elites, one of the reasons for which elites hated democracy was that they were afraid they would redistribute property and cancel debts. There's very, very little evidence that they did, as long as the democracy was anyway very much geared towards the lower classes. The lower classes were in charge, and therefore, instead of cancelling that, they just enforced high level of redistribution. Like in classical Athens in the 4th century, the only people paying any kind of direct tax on their wealth and on their income, any kind of income, direct taxation, was the top 4% of the population. Nobody else paid direct tax. This was a place which is in a pre-modern context is almost unheard of, in which there was no direct extraction of any kind on agricultural produce for small landholders and the like. As long as it was like that, they didn't cancel debts. When it got more unequal, calls were made and there was pressure.
I would jump into a question that, directly connected to that, because going again from an Eastern perspective, in those places where debt cancellation was not part of the picture, people just simply stepped out of the city, and so you have these one of the physiological responses, and this is, for example, what for some historians is what brought to the creation of Jewish identity, for example. Israelite, Judahites, and many others. They just, in a moment in which city-states are no more having this kind of ruled by kings, but the kings stopped cancelling debt. You have all these masses of indebted people that simply start their own thing outside of the city border. Mm-hmm. Is it something that there's an opportunity for? Because to me, when I think of Athens, I studied in school and then I stopped. I think of this city that has a large control on the countryside. Is there that kind of possibility of just stepping out? Because in other places, that's an option.
Right. Depends when, and in the general context of the Greek city, depends where. I think that was very much a possibility, and in fact, it was a reality in the 7th and 6th century BC, before the establishment of democracy in the kind of formative stage. In that period, we do have some evidence, although it's later, of an issue of debt. We do know even from contemporary evidence that, for example, there was an issue about enslavement for debts. Solon, the great Athenian legislator that was considered the founder of the constitution in later centuries, he acted around at the very beginning of the 6th century BC. He made many reforms. Some of them are better attested than others. But one thing we know he did, because he boasts about it in his own poetry, he made it impossible to borrow on the security of your own body, which is a very complex way to say he made enslavement for debt illegal. And that was never reversed in Athens and was spread around. Before him, Athenians could be enslaved because they fall into debt. After him, that's not possible anymore. It cannot happen. My own understanding of that century and of that particular moment is also that Attica was not as filled up as some older histories of Attica make it out to be, which means that There were issues about the city's control on the territory. There were issues of people just kind of going and cultivating areas outside the formal control of the city or of this or that potentate. And what you had was attempt to extract rent from these people, which sounded more like relying on regimes of death and tenancy, and more like mafia protection rackets by big men that try to say, well, you may be that far from the city, but you still need to pay me, otherwise I'll come and set fire to your fields. No, by the classical period, that land is occupied. Attica is by and large full, but that's not always like that. Later on, Attica becomes less heavily populated, and you have evidence of areas in which people can just go. During the Roman period, we have a fictional speech by a guy called Dio of Prusa. I won't tell you who he is, doesn't matter. But he dramatizes an assembly debate in a small polis in Euboea, in an island nearby. And the debate is all about this guy that lives kind of at the border of the city, and nobody's ever seen him in the assembly. And he's built his farm, he's got his own field, and he just lives a bit like a wild man in his own area. It's unclear whether he's even a member of the polis. He's just kind of freed some land and done his own thing. And then some people try to paint him as a rich man that is trying to not to pay tax. And some people say, he never got anything from the polis. Why should he pay anything to the polis? So you've got that kind of thing in later time. And in peripheral areas, I think there was always an issue of occupation. I mean, we should never imagine this world, except in certain places at certain time, as a fully occupied world. There were spaces to go. There were mountains somewhere always where you could go and make your own village communities or something. I got a hand up for Stas, I think.
Yeah, hey, look, with this information about 6th century BC Greek ruler makes enslavement for death illegal, and with your what you said previously about Athenians who only own one slave can still participate in a democracy even though they had to work alongside with the slave. Where do the slaves come from then?
Yeah.
If enslaving your own people is illegal, and slaves being so cheap, I would expect this is because abundant supply. That means someone has a lot of them. Where do they come from?
They come from far away, like relatively far away. They come from Phrygia, I was talking before, that kind of area in South Anatolia. They come from a variety of places all around the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire. They come from Syria. A lot of them come from Thrace. Some of them are Greek, but percentually very few of them. And even if they are Greek, they come from somewhere else. They come. Usually, the Greeks are prisoners of war that have been sold in the slave markets at some point, but they are a small minority. In reality, there's almost an equation made between slave and non-Greek. So slaving zones are particular areas outside the boundaries of what is considered the Greek world. And we're talking about an enormous scale of slave trade from the western provinces of the Persian Empire, from Anatolia, the Near East, Thrace, the Chersonese up there around the Black Sea, where they're fighting now. Those were slaving zones that fed the economy of the Greek cities for centuries. So that's what
Maybe I can correct the question a little bit. I was mostly asking about mode of acquisition of slaves. That is wars of conquests, the Greek city-states going and capturing slaves, or how was it done?
There is an element of that. In the very early, like in Homer, slaves are usually people that have been kind of at the losing end of some kind of squabble, but there's also kind of slaving raids and stuff like that. You still have throughout Greek history slaves that come out of wars of conquest, but mostly not by kind of necessarily by Greek cities, sometime later on by people like Alexander the Great. But the vast majority of slaves they come from internal raids from these slaving regions that don't really involve, in the first instance, Greeks at all. Like, we have evidence for Thracian potentates attacking the next village along, enslaving all the people, and then bringing it to the closest Greek harbor on the coast to sell, and then they put them on a ship and they send them on the... so...
It's like Atlantic slave.
Yeah,
It's
basically,
like
yeah.
yeah.
Basically, yes, yeah. So that's it's very similar in that respect. There's less evidence for that kind of thing in the 6th century when Solon was doing his reforms, and at that time there must have been a significant amount of internal enslavement. But that became a no-no after that. So there was this combination of massive economic growth, high availability of resources, of things to sell for the Greeks, money, precious metals. The Greek world and this kind of area of the Aegean became an economic powerhouse, and then less developed areas started providing the human material for part of the economy. And just a correction about what I said before. I said that I was trying to make the point that, at least in the classical and early Hellenistic period, not only rich people had slaves. So even relatively poor people would have at least one slave. But that doesn't mean that everybody who went in the assembly had a slave. There were people without slaves, and they still had full rights and participated and were in the assembly. I'm just to make the point that slave ownership is not reserved for the very rich, although the very rich would have 20, 30, 40, 100 slaves, whereas a craftsman with a shop on the Agora making shoes would have one working with him or something like that. Okay.
This is interesting. Most of data that I'm running against makes it look very different. The mode of slave acquisition in Roman times and Greek times, put in contrast with Atlantic slave. Atlantic slave is like economic enterprise, and Greek Roman story is a gold slave industrial complex. But if you look at this, if we can like bring these two histories together, maybe there is something, because, well, there is a story how Africans were selling their own people for beads and stuff, and we are told that they're being just childishly naive and stupid to just go for beads and things like that. Well, if Greeks were exporting gold to Phrygia and acquiring slaves, locally enslaved in that region for gold, does it mean that the local people worshipped gold just the same way as African people in 16th used beads?
Mostly it wasn't gold. It was most Greek coinage was silver coinage.
Silver,
in Athens, yeah. But also there were a variety of luxury goods, and of course, elites of this area were very fond of Greek luxury goods, but not just in the East. I mean, even in the West. I mean, if you think about the fact that if you like a big chunk of the evidence we have for Greek vases come from Etruria. Apparently Etruscan elites were obsessed with getting Attic pottery, painted Attic pottery, and so they were a manufacturing and commercial powerhouse, and everybody wanted their products, and they sold them and they got slaves. Certain places like Athens and Delos and certain ports, they were essentially the commercial, at that time they were the commercial centers of the Eastern Mediterranean. It was quite clear. So they had availability of money and all of that. I'm just writing down here a couple of recentish books which in my opinion are very, very good about slave systems. One of them is by David Lewis, which is called Greek Slave Systems in their Near Eastern Context, which is a truly comparative work which looks at basically slave practices in Greece in comparison with Persian, Carthaginian, Phoenician, and all of that kind of thing. And then also a very good book by Kostas Vlassopoulos, which came out even more recently for Edinburgh University Press, which is called Historicizing Greek Slavery, which actually talks very extensively about whether we should use the transatlantic trade as a model for studying Greek slavery or not, and what happens if we do and what happens if we don't, and differences and all of that. So these are the references, which may be not correct because I'm going by heart, but might be useful.
So we actually at the end of our time, there is a last question from Lisa Gam, who maybe wants to talk herself. Lisa, are you here?
It was just a curiosity around the role of women in this structure and the difference between the consideration of household property and were women, as I said in my question, considered slaves, or was this kind of a different kind of structure for women? And I know that that's probably another hour-long talk, so maybe briefly.
I try to be quick, yeah. They obviously this was a patriarchal society with all the trappings of a patriarchal society, and women were excluded from most kind of roles. But no, free women were very much not considered the same as slaves. In fact, enslaved women were very distinctive. Free women had, in most democracies, also women assumed some kind of variation of citizenship, because one of the rules for being a citizen was that you were to be born of two citizens. So in Athens, you were only a citizen if both your father and your mother were citizens, which means that women ancestry and their dignity as members of the Athenian community was recognized and allowed, although their agency was limited. Women, there was variation between cities, but women, for example, could own property, but by and large, they could not manage their own property. The women also had certain public roles which approached those of civic officials, but they were mostly limited to the religious realm. But both their participation to the public sphere and their access to priesthoods and this kind of thing were regulated and reserved for certain categories in the very same way as they did for men. So what you have, like, there's a lot of debate about this. Some people that are very, very concerned with the religious nature of the Greek world say, well, women were citizens. They had access to most of the religious ceremonies. They were priests. They did all of that, no? I think, yeah, but they couldn't go to the assembly. They couldn't make decisions for themselves. So they were not citizens properly. But they were, their status was understood metaphorically as a variation on the prototype of the man, which means that citizen women were citizens in their own way. Free women were still free in their own way. And of course, enslaved women were enslaved in their own way. So that's the shortish answer.
Thank you very much, Mirko. So maybe I can ask the question that we wouldn't answer now, but for the future, just to I'm sharing my thoughts. So David was talking about patriarchal world as the ideas of the slavery and modern capitalism,
Yes.
and the idea of property. And so it's interesting how it's like born in Greece in this case, not as gave us a democracy, but actually gave us all of this line of thoughts that we still inhabiting.
Yeah, I'm actually running a project right now, a big project on class struggle in ancient Greek democracy, and I am working on kind of modes of production and so on. And I am a big fan of David's essay, in which he talks about the capitalist system as essentially a variation on the slave mode of production, or at least I think if you combine this level of commercial capitalism that he had in the Greek world, this heavy reliance on market, this transfer of kind of humans and individuals as capital, you find a certain level of commodification which sounds like an antecedent of modern capitalist forms, which again, I think is not much a way to say, so this is kind of a bad society. I'm a historian, I'm not very interested. It's more a way of seeing over and over again the sad fact that we seem always to kind of be playing along a trade-off between different forms of inclusion and different forms of exclusion. But yeah, I think this world is, in its own funny way, is something like, I mean, my fellow historians will kill me for this, but I think is something of a kind of proto-capitalist world of commercial capitalism, a proto-capitalist island inserted in a sea of feudal tributary systems all around, of all these empires. That's how I see it today, but I'm working on this, so perhaps tomorrow I'll see it in a different way.